German High Command said Americans had no tactical imagination. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lies under a brittle frost. Dawn struggles through low-hanging fog, blurring trees into gray silhouettes. Mud clings to boots and tank treads. Every step sinks. Every breath hangs in the cold air like smoke. German officers huddle around maps, fingers tracing familiar roads, hedgerows, villages. Reports insist the Americans are predictable, slow to adapt, rigid in attack, bound by doctrine. Confidence hums in the command posts. Yet the forest is quiet. Too quiet. Somewhere beyond the ridge, engines idle. Tanks, half-concealed, wait. Infantry shuffles through the mist, rifles slung, eyes scanning the fog-draped tree-line. The men know the terrain, yet they cannot read the unseen movements that will decide the day. Artillery pieces lie dormant in the frost, their barrels cold, metal contracting. Birds stir nervously in the trees, silenced as the wind shifts. Every sound seems amplified. The clink of a bayonet, the snap of ice underfoot, the distant rumble of vehicles on hardened earth. History holds its breath here, in these hours before fire and steel collide. Decisions made in cramped tents and frostbitten foxholes will ripple across the front, shaping lives, destroying formations, rewriting expectation. And yet, the commanders remain certain of one thing. The Americans will act as they always have, predictable, unimaginative, unprepared. But certainty can be fatal. By late 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a precarious equilibrium. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy in June. Months of grinding combat had forced German forces into defensive positions along hedgerows, forests, and river lines. Cities lay in ruin, roads were cratered, and rail networks disrupted. Fuel and ammunition were precious commodities, rationed and carefully deployed. Yet, from the vantage of German High Command, there remained an opportunity. Intelligence reports, often filtered through optimistic or outdated sources, suggested that American forces relied heavily on frontal assaults, rigid infantry formations, and overwhelming firepower to break entrenched positions. This perception had roots in early encounters. In Sicily and Italy during 1943, American infantry had advanced methodically, relying on artillery, engineers, and close air support. The Germans observed disciplined units moving in coordinated waves, sometimes faltering under heavy fire, but often advancing in predictable patterns. This predictability reinforced the impression that Americans lacked improvisational skill, that their tactics were formalized to a fault. Berlin's strategic thinking further encouraged this assessment. Hitler demanded results quickly. The High Command faced political pressure to hold territory, deny crossings, and, above all, inflict casualties that would stall the Allied advance. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea through the Ardennes, along the Rhine, and into the industrial heart of Germany. Every kilometer held immense strategic value. The loss of a bridge or village could expose flanks and unravel entire divisions. Doctrine reinforced these assumptions. German infantry manuals emphasized disciplined lines, overlapping fields of fire, and pre-planned maneuvers. German armored doctrine prized combined arms operations, but required initiative from officers trained to expect enemy predictability. By contrast, American doctrine was evolving. Small unit leaders were encouraged to exercise discretion, coordinate with armor and artillery dynamically, and adapt to terrain in real time. Yet these subtleties were invisible to distant German commanders who relied on intercepted reports, prisoner statements, and aerial reconnaissance. The stage for miscalculation was set. German officers, confident in their interpretation of the battlefield, began preparing operations under the assumption that American units could be channeled, delayed, and decisively engaged. The Ardennes, with its dense forests and winding roads, was ideal for ambush, for exploiting rigidity. Yet the same terrain that seemed advantageous to planners was equally unforgiving. Fog, frost, and uneven ground could conceal movement, disrupt communications, and magnify minor errors into catastrophic failures. Supply constraints added pressure. Fuel shortages forced armored units to conserve movement. Artillery was rationed, limiting preparatory bombardments. Infantry units were understrength, stretched along vulnerable sectors. Commanders expected American attacks to follow traditional patterns: linear assaults against prepared positions, predictable flanking attempts, reliance on heavy artillery barges. The assumption was reinforced by captured documents and interrogations of prisoners, whose accounts were incomplete, often filtered through fear or misperception. In Washington and London, the American war machine continued to adapt. Lessons from Italy and Normandy informed doctrine. Platoons and companies moved flexibly, exploiting weak points in defenses, coordinating across unit types, and reacting to unexpected threats. Communications technology, while primitive by modern standards, allowed for rapid adaptation. Artillery units could shift fire with unprecedented speed. Engineers could bridge rivers under fire. Radio-equipped forward observers transformed the battlefield into a constantly updating map of action and reaction. Yet these developments were invisible to German planners in the Ardennes. They could not see the small unit initiative, the decentralized command, the capacity of American troops to exploit gaps in terrain or enemy focus. All they saw were the rigid formations described in outdated intelligence, the heavy tanks and artillery that suggested an unyielding approach. In their minds, tactical imagination belonged to them, to disciplined officers who had learned to exploit every weakness in the opponent's front. To the German high command, Americans were instruments of firepower, not improvisation, not cunning. As the frost hardened the soil and fog clung to the forest, these assumptions solidified into plans. Maps were drawn with confidence. Orders were issued. Units were positioned to meet what commanders believed was the inevitable American advance. Every hedgerow, every village, every bridge was plotted for defense. Yet the planners failed to account for one simple fact. The Americans they assumed predictable were not. They could adapt, improvise, and strike where least expected. History was poised on this miscalculation. The next weeks would test not only tactical doctrine, but human intuition, resilience, and the deadly consequences of underestimating an enemy's imagination. The Ardennes, in mid-December 1944, was a theater of deceptive calm. Narrow roads threaded between dense forests. Villages were scattered and small, their stone walls providing both cover and obstruction. Snow had begun to fall intermittently, soft at first, then crusting over mud and ice, slowing movement. Rivers meandered through the valleys, partially frozen, their banks lined with brambles and stunted trees. For infantry and armor alike, every step required careful calculation. A single misjudgment could leave a platoon exposed or a tank immobilized. German commanders exploited this knowledge, or so they thought. The plan that would soon be executed, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, relied on precise timing and assumptions of enemy predictability. The Ardennes, lightly defended by what Berlin considered green American divisions, seemed an opportunity to split Allied lines, capture key bridges, and disrupt supply chains. German intelligence, however, was flawed. Many American units were exhausted but not inexperienced. Patrol reports, captured notes, and interrogations often overstated rigidity or underreported flexibility. Supply constraints weighed heavily. Fuel shortages dictated that armored units could move only along main arteries. Any detour risked demobilization. Artillery shells were stockpiled for critical objectives, limiting preparatory bombardments. Infantry units were often under strength, forced to hold extended fronts. These limitations meant that German plans required near-perfect execution. Any delay, any deviation, would cascade into failure. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. Early winter storms had closed the skies to Allied air reconnaissance. Fog and low clouds shielded German movements, but also impaired visibility for their own units. Snow muffled footsteps and engine noise, concealing advances, but could equally conceal hazards, frozen ditches, uneven terrain, or concealed obstacles. Men moved through icy forests, rifles slung, boots crunching over frozen leaves, aware of the fragility of their positions. Communication lines were stretched, relying on runners or field telephones that frequently froze or broke. Radios existed, but channels were crowded and signals often intercepted. German officers, however, remained confident. Their assumptions rested on doctrine, intelligence, and observation of previous engagements. They expected American forces to hold rigid lines, to respond predictably to artillery and tank pressure, to be slow in reorganizing after contact. Commanders believed that speed and surprise could offset deficiencies in fuel, artillery, and manpower. In their calculations, the enemy would falter where terrain and firepower intersected. American forces were aware of the Ardennes potential vulnerability, but were unprepared for the scale of the German offensive. Training emphasized flexibility and initiative at small unit levels. Soldiers were taught to exploit gaps, coordinate fire with armor, and adapt to unexpected threats. In practice, this meant that even inexperienced units could perform beyond German expectations. Patrols moved with discretion, reconnaissance constantly updated intelligence, and supply systems allowed for rapid resupply where infrastructure permitted. Commanders in the field made decisions without waiting for headquarters approval, a contrast to German rigidity. The Germans' misjudgment extended beyond tactics into psychology. Reports suggested that American soldiers would be hesitant under fire, reliant on officers for every maneuver. In reality, fatigue and discipline combined with doctrine had produced units capable of improvisation. Small engagements that German officers expected to stall in advance often became opportunities for American units to counterattack, flank, or hold terrain unexpectedly. Every hedgerow, village, and crossroads was part of the calculation. Orders were issued with precision, times scheduled down to the hour, and movements choreographed in coordination with armor, infantry, and engineers. Yet these meticulously planned sequences did not account for adaptability. Terrain that seemed advantageous for ambushes could be bypassed. Attacks expected to crush defensive lines could be absorbed and countered. As night fell over the Ardennes on December 15, 1944, units moved into position. German troops, confident in their intelligence, prepared for a decisive blow. Artillery emplacements were camouflaged, armored columns concealed along forest tracks, infantry dug into foxholes and hedgerows. Radio silence was maintained, discipline was enforced. Yet, beneath the surface, the conditions of winter, terrain, and an underestimated opponent created a tension that could not be predicted in any map or report. The stage was set for one of the largest and most audacious German offensives of the war. Plans, assumptions, and miscalculations coalesced into a single moment of potential catastrophe. The Ardennes waited. Soldiers on both sides were poised, unaware that the clash about to erupt would test doctrine, endurance, and imagination in ways neither German planners nor American forces could fully anticipate. History's hinge was positioned precisely here, between expectation and reality, assumption and action, confidence and consequence. Human cost. December in the Ardennes was a study in endurance. Soldiers' faces were lined with frost, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and the unrelenting tension of anticipation. Boots froze to icy mud. Fingers numb, trembling, struggled with cold weapons. Men carried the weight of their packs and rifles over uneven terrain, every step a small act of persistence. Hunger gnawed where rations were delayed. Letters from home were few, often delayed by days or weeks. In command posts, clerks and officers pored over maps by candlelight, the low hum of whispered orders punctuated by the occasional cough or creak of frost-laden beams. Fear was omnipresent but subtle. It did not announce itself with panic. It manifested as hesitation, as an unsteady hand on a rifle, as the tight knot in the stomach when boots crunched over snow. Units that had been on continuous patrols for days showed signs of fatigue, eyes glassy, reaction slowed, coordination fraying. Yet discipline persisted. Soldiers knew that one mistake could cost not only their lives, but those of the men beside them. The human cost, while invisible in maps or reports, shaped every decision, every hesitation, every cautious advance into the forest. 2. Tactical reality. The Ardennes imposed constraints that dictated tactics. Roads were narrow, winding, and often blocked by fallen trees, snowdrifts, or destroyed vehicles. Tanks could advance only in columns. Infantry was forced to move on parallel tracks, often exposed to hidden machine gun nests. Villages, with stone walls and tight streets, became microcosms of defensive complexity. A single well-placed mortar or bazooka round could halt a column for hours. American small units exploited these limitations. Patrols moved through forests in dispersed formations, reconnoitering every hedgerow, tracking footprints, and listening for the faintest metallic echo of approaching vehicles. Infantry paired with engineers could clear obstacles quickly. Tanks provided suppressive fire but relied on infantry guidance through constricted routes. German forces, expecting straightforward engagements, encountered ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and improvised defenses that subverted their assumptions. Coordination between unit types was critical. Artillery fire needed precise targeting to avoid friendly casualties. Armor required infantry support to prevent isolation. Radio communications, though primitive, allowed for real-time adjustments. Orders from the command post were never absolute. Adaptation at the squad and company level determined survival. Tactical reality, in the Ardennes, was a dynamic balance of terrain, equipment, and human judgment. What German officers assumed would be predictable behavior became a continuous negotiation with the environment and the opponent. 3. Technological limitations. Winter warfare in the Ardennes tested the limits of equipment. Tanks ground along frozen mud, often stalling on hidden ruts or icy patches. Half-tracks choked on snow, engines coughing in the cold. Artillery, though powerful, required precise calculations for elevation and distance. Frozen ground made emplacement slow, and shifting frost could alter targeting. Radios were temperamental, batteries drained quickly in sub-zero conditions, wires snapped under frost, and signal interference was common in dense forests. Weapons themselves were affected. Rifles jammed in freezing moisture. Machine guns overheated from sustained fire, then cooled unevenly, risking misfire. Mortars relied on dry powder and stable footing. Any deviation could send rounds wide, endangering friendly units. Observers using binoculars or maps contended with fog and low light, often misjudging distances and enemy positions. German commanders relied heavily on assumptions of technological advantage, superior training with artillery, familiarity with armored warfare, and disciplined infantry equipped with Panzerfausts, MG-42s, and Sturmgewehrs. Yet the Americans, though sometimes less experienced with these weapons, compensated with innovation, flexibility, and sheer adaptability. Field expedients, wooden bridges to cross ditches, improvised camouflage, and constant repositioning of artillery demonstrated a practical ingenuity that German intelligence had underestimated. Technology, in this frozen forest, was not decisive on its own. It required operators, improvisation, and situational awareness. Even the most advanced German tanks could be trapped by terrain. Even the most experienced artillery teams could misfire under fogged conditions. The Americans, often slower in execution but unburdened by rigid assumptions, turned these limitations into opportunities. Leadership decisions. Command in the Ardennes was a test of precision and foresight. German officers issued orders from tents or commandeered buildings, maps spread across tables, fingers tracing roads and rivers. They relied on doctrine that prized rapid concentration of armor, coordinated artillery strikes, and the exploitation of perceived weaknesses. Every unit, every platoon, had a designated role, a fixed schedule. Confidence in intelligence reports reinforced rigid execution. Americans would react as they had elsewhere, predictably, linearly, without improvisation. Yet even the most meticulous plans were vulnerable to reality. Officers had to contend with terrain, weather, and the variable morale of troops. Misplaced units, delayed vehicles, and frozen equipment threatened to unravel the timetable. Some commanders attempted contingency planning, but communication lines were fragile, orders arrived late or not at all. Decisions made at the top filtered imperfectly to the front, forcing lower-level leaders to improvise while still adhering to overarching doctrine. In many cases, hesitation or misreading of the enemy's movements could prove fatal. American leadership contrasted sharply. Officers encouraged initiative, delegating authority to platoon and company commanders who understood the microcosm of their sectors. Decisions were made in real time, responsive to changing conditions. When German artillery fell short, American infantry repositioned. When a road was blocked, engineers improvised a crossing. Leadership in this context was less about issuing absolute commands and more about constant adaptation. The German assumption that centralized, rigid control could dominate the battlefield underestimated this decentralized ingenuity. 2. Enemy miscalculations. German confidence rested on a series of miscalculations, each compounding the next. Intelligence reports overstated American adherence to linear tactics and underestimated their ability to coordinate combined arms operations. Prisoners' statements painted a picture of hesitancy and procedural obedience. Reconnaissance often mistook small unit maneuvers for disorganization. Analysts failed to account for the Americans' ability to regroup, redistribute forces, and exploit gaps. Terrain further magnified these miscalculations. Dense forests and snow-covered roads concealed movement, slowed columns, and disrupted timing. German planners anticipated choke points that would halt the Americans. Instead, they became locations where small units could maneuver unpredictably. Engineers built makeshift bridges, scouts scouted untracked paths, and infantry infiltrated where rigid doctrine predicted frontal engagement. The overconfidence of German planners led to operational risk. Units were stretched thin to achieve breakthroughs, artillery allocations were optimized for expected patterns, and fuel consumption was calculated based on predictable enemy positions. When reality diverged from expectation, entire formations faced paralysis. Misjudging an opponent's tactical imagination would prove catastrophic, revealing that battlefield supremacy depended as much on perception and adaptability as on firepower. 3. Psychological strain. Beneath the calculations and doctrine, the human mind was tested. Soldiers and officers alike bore the weight of anticipation and responsibility. The cold was relentless, the darkness oppressive, the uncertainty constant. Decisions made in command posts could mean life or death for hundreds of men. Mistakes in judgment were unforgiving. German troops faced the psychological strain of expectation versus reality. They were told the enemy would behave in certain ways, yet engagements unfolded unpredictably. Hesitation, fear, and frustration compounded exhaustion. A delayed order or misread map could cascade into confusion on the front lines, eroding confidence. Even experienced officers, schooled in combined arms tactics, found themselves reacting to the unanticipated improvisation of their adversaries. American soldiers endured their own pressures. Fatigue, exposure, and hunger were constant companions. Yet the doctrine of initiative offered a psychological counterweight. Decision-making at lower levels, combined with real-time observation of enemy behavior, fostered a sense of agency. The capacity to act decisively within uncertainty mitigated fear, allowing units to exploit German assumptions. Psychological strain in this environment was invisible to reports and maps, yet it shaped outcomes. The rigid confidence of German high command, tested against the adaptive resilience of American forces, would not only determine the tactical outcome, but reveal the limits of doctrine when confronted with human ingenuity and endurance. Climax/Turning Point, Part 1. December 16, 1944. 3:30. Darkness still blankets the Ardennes. A thin frost coats the roads. Tanks and half-tracks huddle along forest tracks, their engines silent. Infantry crouches in ditches and behind hedgerows, rifles slung, eyes scanning shadows. Command posts are tense, radios quiet. German officers have traced every mile, every village, every choke point on maps. Log-Lees, Stavelot, Hofeleis. Every route is assigned. Every unit has a schedule. Every artillery tube has a target. Confidence hums in the frost, absolute. At precisely 5:30, artillery erupts. Shells pound the western edge of the 106th Infantry Division's sector. Snow shatters under impact. Trees splinter. Earth is thrown skyward in violent arcs. Machine guns crack in response, though American units are temporarily pinned behind frozen ditches and hedgerows. Smoke and steam rise from the frozen ground. German infantry begins forward movement, advancing behind creeping barges, panzer divisions rolling along narrow roads. Everything is calculated for maximum effect, yet reality immediately diverges from expectation. Small American squads, having dug shallow foxholes overnight, move laterally through side paths. Forward observers redirect artillery fire to block advancing tanks. Engineers improvise roadways around immobilized columns. Where German officers predicted stasis, Americans maneuver fluidly. By 6:15, Kampfgruppe, spearheading the 1st SS Panzer Division, engages in the first village assault. Streets are narrow. Snow conceals anti-tank mines, improvised barricades, and ambush positions. MG-42 fire rakes through open areas, but American soldiers emerge from cellars and side alleys, directing bazooka teams at flanks. Tanks stall on icy roads. Infantry must cover exposed armored units. The German timetable begins to slip. Simultaneously, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, advancing through forested terrain near Stoumont, encounters small unit resistance far more adaptive than reports suggested. Patrols engage in short, coordinated firefights, withdrawing only to reposition in unexpected locations. German commanders, relying on rigidity, are forced to issue new orders under pressure. By 7:30, delays compound. Columns back up, communication lines stretch thin, and advancing units become interdependent in ways unanticipated in the original plan. At 8 o'clock, American artillery coordination begins to show its effect. Forward observers direct fire with precision, targeting road junctions and tank concentrations. Trees fall across roads, vehicles become trapped, and infantry is forced to improvise. German planners had assumed suppression would be near total. Instead, the Americans exploit gaps and weaknesses with real-time adjustments. The psychological strain is immediate. Soldiers who had trained for months under the assumption of predictable opposition now confront a fluid, reactive enemy. Commanders face split-second decisions: advance into resistance, reroute units, or risk isolation. The initial confidence of German officers, bolstered by doctrine and intelligence, begins to waver. Every delay magnifies risk. Every miscalculation exposes flanks. In the southern sector, near Malmedy, the 1st SS Panzer's advance encounters another divergence from expectation. American engineers have destroyed bridges in minor villages, forcing tanks into choke points. Infantry covers the obstacles, forcing panzer crews to dismount and clear debris under fire. The speed and decisiveness of small unit American actions contrasts sharply with German planning assumptions. What was intended as a rapid breakthrough now becomes a series of tactical negotiations with terrain and opposition, each moment fraught with risk and consequence. By mid-morning, the clash between expectation and reality is clear. German forces, meticulously planned and disciplined, face an adaptive, flexible opponent. Units that should have been easily channeled and destroyed evade encirclement. American squads seize the initiative in localized engagements, redirect artillery, and hold key crossroads. The carefully synchronized timetable fractures under the pressure of improvisation and terrain. The first irreversible cracks appear. Delays in one sector cascade into others. Tank columns pile up on forest tracks. Infantry becomes entangled in hedgerows and village streets. Communication with command posts falters. By 11 o'clock, commanders recognize that the American capacity to adapt exceeds initial intelligence estimates. The High Command's assumption that the Americans would act predictably has been falsified on the battlefield. And yet, German forces press forward. Momentum is maintained through discipline and training, despite delays and unexpected resistance. Units continue to advance under fire, improvising where necessary, attempting to adhere to original objectives. The battle has transformed from a controlled offensive into a contest of endurance, adaptation, and real-time decision-making. The Ardennes, silent under frost just hours before, has become a theater of dynamic engagement. Artillery thunders, engines grind, infantry clatters through hedgerows, and radio operators scramble for signals. German assumptions meet reality, not with the expected submission, but with an adaptive, responsive opponent capable of exploiting every hesitation, every delay. By midday, the stage is set for the next phase of irreversible consequence. Momentum, timelines, and expectations collide. Commanders on both sides are pushed to the limits of perception, endurance, and tactical imagination. The carefully orchestrated German plan, predicated on predictable American behavior, has already begun to falter, and history is pivoting in real time. December 16, 1944. 1300 hours. The Ardennes is no longer silent. Smoke rises from villages, curling against gray skies. Artillery craters scar the frozen earth, marking the violent choreography of advance and defense. German armored columns inch forward along constricted roads, engines straining, treads slipping on ice. Infantry moves behind, faces streaked with frost and grime, rifles raised, eyes darting through fog-laden forests. Command posts are tense. Officers speak in clipped tones, issuing corrections, rerouting units, and calculating risk as delay multiplies. Kampfgruppe paper, intended as the spearhead, reaches a crossroads near Stomot. Its timetable is broken. American forces, small squads with bazookas, mines, and artillery guidance, hold or contest every approach. A Panzer IV stalls on a frozen ditch. Infantry is diverted to rescue it under fire. Radio contact flickers. Messages are delayed or misinterpreted. Every unexpected obstacle amplifies the miscalculation. The Americans are not advancing predictably. They adapt, maneuver, and exploit terrain in ways German officers did not anticipate. To the north, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division faces similar challenges. Narrow forest tracks, blocked by fallen trees and improvised obstacles, slow their advance. American soldiers emerge from side paths, attacking flanks and creating localized chaos. Units that should have been suppressed resist with improvised defensive fire. German officers attempt to maintain cohesion, but the sequence of meticulously planned attacks is unraveling. Timetables collapse. Every second counts. By 1500 hours, the psychological impact becomes evident. Fatigue, confusion, and tension ripple through German units. Soldiers, trained to rely on discipline and doctrine, now confront unpredictability. Officers face critical decisions, continue pressing into resistance and risk encirclement, divert forces and compromise objectives, or pause and reorganize. Hesitation, once rare, becomes frequent. Delays in one sector propagate into others. Commanders at higher echelons struggle to maintain situational awareness. American units, though exhausted, exploit every opportunity. Forward observers redirect artillery fire to halt advancing columns. Engineers clear or rebuild paths under fire. Infantry infiltrates abandoned or lightly held buildings, creating pockets of resistance that slow the advance. Small, adaptive actions accumulate into strategic consequences, undermining German assumptions of a predictable enemy. By late afternoon, the initial offensive momentum has begun to falter in critical sectors. Near Malmedy, the consequences of miscalculation are catastrophic. German armored units, concentrated for speed, find themselves trapped along narrow roads, subjected to artillery and small arms fire. Infantry attempting to relieve stalled vehicles is engaged by American squads operating from concealed positions. Communication delays prevent reinforcements from arriving on schedule. Commanders face the brutal reality. Timing and coordination, the foundation of the German plan, have been disrupted beyond recovery in this sector. Across the Ardennes, the effect is compounded. Delays in one area cascade into others. Artillery support cannot be repositioned fast enough. Units become isolated, roads congested with immobilized vehicles. Terrain that was intended as an advantage, the dense forest, narrow roads, and hedgerows, now hampers maneuver. The Germans' reliance on predictability has become their vulnerability. At 1800 hours, dusk falls, and the forest grows shadowed and indistinct. Smoke mixes with fog, reducing visibility further. The initial confidence of the morning is replaced by tactical uncertainty. Commanders issue night halts and revised objectives, but coordination is incomplete. Units dig in, fortifying positions that were meant to be points of breakthrough. American troops, meanwhile, continue to move opportunistically, reinforcing weak points, exploiting gaps, and maintaining initiative despite exhaustion. By nightfall, the first day of the offensive demonstrates a profound truth. Assumptions about the enemy's rigidity have been decisively challenged. German plans, constructed on intelligence, doctrine, and expectation, clash with the reality of adaptive, resilient American forces. Small unit initiative, combined arms coordination, and situational improvisation have disrupted timing, fractured momentum, and created vulnerabilities that will have long-term consequences. In command posts, officers note discrepancies in reports, units out of position, and delays that magnify as night deepens. Confidence erodes under the weight of unforeseen resistance. Men at the front, exhausted and tense, realize the scale of the gap between planning and reality. The Ardennes is no longer a controlled offensive. It is a testing ground for endurance, decision-making under pressure, and the limits of doctrine. History pivots here. The German High Command, certain that Americans would act as expected, confronts the consequences of underestimating tactical imagination. Momentum, meticulously planned and anticipated, falters. Coordination, supposed to secure success, instead exposes weakness. Adaptation and initiative, long underestimated, shape the battlefield in real time. The Ardennes has become a proving ground not just for weaponry and numbers, but for the capacity of human decision-making under extreme conditions. By the end of the first night, the first irreversible consequences are clear. Delays, disrupted columns, and fractured plans have undermined objectives. The German assumption that Americans would behave predictably has been invalidated, setting the stage for cascading operational failures. And as frost settles over the forest, the stage is set for the aftermath, a reckoning measured not in doctrine or assumption, but in human cost and strategic consequence. Aftermath, Part 1. December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest is silent again, though the silence is fractured by distant artillery, sporadic gunfire, and the groaning of vehicles stranded on icy roads. Snow is marred by tracks, churned mud, and the shapes of abandoned equipment. For both sides, the cost of the opening hours is already evident. German units are dispersed and delayed. Kampfgruppe paper, once poised for a decisive breakthrough, has lost cohesion. Tanks are immobilized along narrow roads. Half-tracks remain stalled behind obstacles or destroyed vehicles. Infantry, intended to advance behind armored spearheads, is scattered among hedgerows and villages, forced into defensive positions rather than pressing the offensive. The timetable, so meticulously planned, has collapsed in multiple sectors. Commanders scramble to re-establish order, issuing revised objectives, but coordination is difficult. Casualties are mounting. Reports indicate that in Paper's sector alone, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles have been disabled, destroyed, or abandoned. German infantry suffers losses not only from direct engagement, but from exposure, exhaustion, and accidents as units navigate treacherous terrain. American artillery and small unit actions inflict additional damage. By midday, estimates from surviving German units suggest that upwards of 1,200 personnel have been killed, wounded, or captured in the first 24 hours. American forces, though under pressure, maintain cohesion. Units exploit German miscalculations, reinforcing weak points and maintaining flexibility. Engineers repair or improvise crossings. Artillery is repositioned to target the most vulnerable enemy concentrations. Forward observers relay intelligence, allowing commanders to respond in near real time. The casualties, while significant, are mitigated by adaptive planning and decentralized command. The human toll is compounded by psychological strain. German soldiers face the shock of encountering resistance that defies expectation. Confidence erodes as units experience repeated setbacks in areas that were assumed secure. Officers confront the consequences of misjudged enemy capabilities and the fragility of their own planning. Even experienced commanders, trained in armored warfare and combined arms operations, find themselves reacting to circumstances rather than controlling them. Material losses are stark. Dozens of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Tigers are disabled or destroyed. Artillery positions are overrun or abandoned. Ammunition and fuel caches are lost to the advancing Americans. Bridges, roads, and supply routes are contested or damaged, limiting further mobility. Communications infrastructure, field telephones, radios, signal wires, is disrupted, amplifying confusion. The precision of the German plan, once a source of confidence, has become a liability, leaving units vulnerable to isolation and counterattack. Operational disruption extends beyond immediate losses. Delays in one sector ripple into others, preventing timely reinforcement and resupply. Units that were to concentrate on key objectives are now diverted to recovery, defensive positions, or improvised attacks. The offensive, designed for speed and surprise, has slowed to a series of fragmented engagements. The High Command, reliant on assumptions of American predictability, finds itself forced to reassess, often without sufficient intelligence or communication. The first 24 hours also exposed the limits of German logistical planning. Fuel shortages, previously calculated under idealized timelines, now constrain armored movements further. Artillery support cannot be repositioned rapidly, leaving some units vulnerable. Infantry, dependent on the pace of armored support, is delayed and fatigued. The mismatch between plan and execution becomes increasingly visible, highlighting a critical vulnerability in relying on predictable enemy behavior. Yet, amid these losses, the Americans demonstrate resilience. Small units, empowered to act independently, exploit gaps, block choke points, and reinforce threatened sectors. Casualties among American troops are significant, but training, doctrine, and adaptability allow units to maintain cohesion. Reports from command posts indicate that even inexperienced divisions respond dynamically, exploiting opportunities as they emerge. By nightfall, the forest tells the story of miscalculation. Tracks in the snow, abandoned vehicles, and hastily fortified positions mark the opening of an offensive that was intended to be decisive. German high command confronts the first evidence that rigid assumptions about enemy behavior have failed. The human, material, and operational cost of this misjudgment is visible in every frozen ditch, every disrupted column, and every exhausted soldier. History is now measuring consequence not by plan, but by the capacity of humans to adapt under extreme pressure. The first day of the Ardennes offensive confirms a simple truth. Misjudging tactical imagination carries a cost that cannot be reversed. Aftermath, Part 2. December 18, 1944. The Ardennes remains scarred, yet the snow continues to fall lightly, erasing tracks even as devastation persists. German forces, stretched across forested valleys and icy roads, struggle to regroup. Supply lines are fragmented. Armored columns remain immobile in key sectors. Artillery units cannot reach designated positions, and forward infantry faces increasing isolation. The initial offensive momentum, so carefully calculated, has slowed to a precarious crawl. Strategically, the consequences are immediate. The objective of splitting Allied lines and seizing critical bridges is delayed. Villages intended as staging points for rapid armored advancement are contested, destroyed, or occupied by resilient American units. The High Command's expectation of a rapid, decisive penetration is no longer feasible. Units that were to converge on Bastogne and Stavelot are diverted or slowed, creating gaps that Allied commanders exploit. Timing, once the foundation of German operational planning, is now compromised. Verified reports from the front underscore the scale of disruption. Kampfgruppe paper, initially scheduled to cover over 120 kilometers by nightfall, reports delays exceeding 15 hours in certain sectors. Upwards of 50 armored vehicles are abandoned, destroyed, or immobilized due to terrain or enemy action. Infantry units report casualties ranging from 20 to 40% in some forward positions. Communications breakdowns compound these difficulties. Field telephone lines are severed by artillery, and radio signals are sporadic, leaving commanders dependent on delayed reports. The psychological impact on German soldiers and officers is profound. Confidence in high command decisions erodes as the mismatch between expectation and reality becomes undeniable. Experienced commanders, trained in maneuver warfare and combined arms coordination, confront the limits of doctrine when faced with adaptive, flexible opposition. Morale is strained not only by fatigue and cold, but by the realization that their carefully designed plan cannot account for the Americans' improvisational skill. Hesitation grows. Decisions are slowed by the uncertainty of enemy response and the unpredictability of terrain. American forces, meanwhile, benefit psychologically from their adaptability. Units that have successfully resisted attacks gain confidence. Small victories in villages or hedgerows reinforce initiative and coordination. Commanders at platoon and company levels demonstrate autonomy, exploiting gaps, reinforcing threatened sectors, and maintaining pressure. Despite casualties and exhaustion, American morale stabilizes under the doctrine of flexibility and decentralized command. Documented communications from both sides reflect this divergence. German reports to higher command note delays, unexpected resistance, and misalignment of units. Orders attempt to correct timing errors, but communication lags exacerbate the problem. American after-action reports highlight the effectiveness of small unit initiative, the importance of terrain familiarity, and the utility of combined arms coordination in disrupting enemy advances. Historians later note that these early miscalculations presaged the eventual failure of the offensive in its southern sectors. Material losses continue to mount. Ammunition and fuel stockpiles intended to sustain a continuous offensive are depleted faster than anticipated due to improvisation, rerouting, and extended engagements. Bridges destroyed by retreating units or defensive demolitions force delays in armored movements. Roads congested with stalled vehicles hinder reinforcements, and artillery cannot provide timely suppressive fire. The interplay between misjudged enemy behavior and logistical strain compounds the operational collapse. By evening, the human cost is mirrored in the landscape. Snow-covered roads are lined with abandoned vehicles. Hedgerows conceal injured and exhausted soldiers. Villages bear the imprint of firefights and shelling. The first phase of the offensive has exposed the German assumption that Americans lack tactical imagination as dangerously flawed. The battlefield is now defined by adaptation, improvisation, and the limits of rigid planning under pressure. The Ardennes serves as a case study in the consequences of misjudging opponent capability. Strategic shifts are not only operational but psychological. German commanders confront the unreliability of assumptions. Soldiers face unanticipated challenges. American forces capitalize on flexibility and initiative. The ripple effects extend beyond the immediate forested valleys, influencing subsequent decisions, reinforcements, and defensive priorities along the Western Front. By the close of the second day, the first irreversible lessons are clear. Predictability cannot be assumed. Doctrine cannot substitute for observation and adaptation. Human ingenuity, exercised at all levels, can disrupt even the most disciplined and meticulously planned offensive. The Ardennes has become a crucible, measuring not only material and manpower but the limits of assumption, planning, and imagination in modern warfare. The Ardennes, months later, would be remembered in maps, reports, and monuments. Yet the true measure of the battle lies not only in kilometers gained or lost, in tanks destroyed or bridges held, but in the quiet interplay between expectation and reality. German high command, confident in doctrine and intelligence, had assumed predictability. American forces, adaptive and resolute, had rewritten that assumption in real time. History often reduces battles to numbers or outcomes, yet the Ardennes illustrates something subtler. The limits of planning when faced with human ingenuity. Terrain, weather, and equipment matter, but even the most disciplined formations can falter when assumptions about the opponent prove false. A rigid plan, no matter how meticulously drawn, is vulnerable to the unpredictability of human decision-making under pressure. For soldiers on the ground, the war was never abstract. Each frozen hedgerow, each narrow street, each shell-cratered field was a test of endurance, observation, and initiative. The men who survived did so not only because of training or firepower, but because they adapted, improvised, and acted decisively when circumstances deviated from expectation. The Germans had underestimated that capacity, and the consequences were profound. The Ardennes became more than a tactical engagement. It was a mirror of warfare itself. It exposed the limits of doctrine, the cost of misjudgment, and the centrality of adaptability. Commanders learned, too late for some, that an enemy's imagination can be as decisive as their armament. In the end, the forest returned to silence. Snow drifted over the scars of battle, concealing tracks, wreckage, and the traces of human endeavor. Yet beneath the white, the lessons remained. That certainty is fragile, that adaptability is essential, and that the measure of an army is not only in its weapons, but in its capacity to think, respond, and endure. History moves forward, but the Ardennes endures as a quiet testament. A place where the limits of expectation met the reality of tactical imagination, and the consequences echoed far beyond the frost-bound forest.